to yourself. Okay. So thank you very
Right.
much, Marcia, for coming and sharing with us. And we've got this for just started the recording for everybody's notice. We're just really grateful and just a very, very warm welcome to you to our network. And hopefully all the technology will continue to work.
Right. Well, gosh, thank you everyone for being here and wow, what a wonderful group of people working in all these different areas. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint. And as Paul said, I'll talk a little bit about my work, including the recent work. And I'll share that PowerPoint now. But let's see. Then you let me know if you see it now. Does everybody see it?
Yeah. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, I was asked to talk about a journey in child theology. So I thought I would talk about some of the lessons I've learned, uh, my recent work, and some future directions. But as I talk about my work, I was hoping that you might also be asking. And do you see the next slide now with the questions? Okay, I think we're good. Kind of what prompted you to start focusing on children? And what lessons and areas of inquiry have strengthened your work with or on behalf of children? And what is your current work? I'm very anxious to hear. It was really great to hear from everybody and some new directions you would like to pursue. And I think it's all important for all of us, and we think of our own context. How do these robust theologies of childhood and child theology strengthen the church and help all children thrive? So, as I go through some of the things that have informed my work and my journey, think about yours, okay? So that we can share. So, I I want to say at the beginning, I studied theology at the University of Chicago, and I often say this when I was there, the subject of children would have been very marginal. It would be beneath the serious theologian and wouldn't have ever been even a topic. And in my early work, I worked on 18th, 19th century German theology. I studied in Germany. My first book was a translation of Johann Gottfried Herder, a German thinker. And so I had a kind of a chapter of my life devoted to this kind of work. So what I still do some work also in the area of Lutheran theology. I am a Lutheran, belong to the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. And so I continue to do work on Lutheran theologians who've said quite a bit about children too, and also about Lutheran communities in Lutheran. The Lutheran Church is a very worldwide church. In fact, the largest, fastest growing Lutheran church in the world is in Ethiopia. So that is part of my work and part of my teaching. But what got me going with children? I just want to say just a little bit about this story, and you can think about your own story. Um, I have a couple kids, they're 30 and 23 now, but once I had children and starting teaching undergraduates, I just wondered, why are children a marginal topic in theology? Then we would talk about them maybe in pastoral care or religious education, but it really wasn't part of any other, discipline in theology, biblical studies, church history. And I wondered too, a third of the people on this planet are children, and we've all been children or are children. So it should be a topic. And once I started thinking that way, I became less adult-centered and more child-attentive. And then I was just shocked to see that the subject of children is a very central topic. It's in the biblical text, it's in church history, it's in world religions. And so that got me on my roll. It was also an horrible experience in my son's Sunday school. I had to teach the 3-year-olds. I was asked to teach, and I thought, this will be easy. I'm a professor. I can do this like nothing, right? And I was given this curriculum that was horrifying. It wasn't age appropriate. The crafts were even awful with little throwaway kind of crafts, paper plates and popsicle sticks. And so I had to create my own every Saturday I spent all day creating the lesson for the 3-year-olds because I couldn't use anything. And that got me on my search to child theology, by the way. Sorry, to godly play and child theology. So my first book was just a very simple thing. I'd studied history of Christianity, historical theology, and my simple question was, if we look back at the history of Christian thought, because it was thought, maybe they said nothing, theologians in the Christian tradition, about children. So the simple questions, very simple, were simply who are children, what are children? What did these theologians say about that? And what do we owe them? What did they say our obligations are? And we really discovered a lot of interesting things. It was like an untapped area of research, just like when we started thinking about women's studies and gee, are women people? I guess they are. Maybe they did some things in the past. Maybe they have ideas. So it was kind of like that eye-opening experience where you have new questions, right? But that was the simple thing. And because of that, I really learned a lot about theologies of childhood, what and what are our conceptions of children. And I believe they are foundational to helping children thrive when we're working with children in the church. And they have many positive implications for our work with children, for the church, and for our communities. So the simple questions really of theologies of childhood that I learned in my early work was simply, what are our conceptions of children? What are our commitments to them? Because these two are so related. You have strong conceptions of children and strong commitments go hand in hand. And I've talked about that quite a bit, but if you see children as simply sinful and you've got to, get them in line, then you have a very weak relation to children, right? Weak obligations to them. So I really came away with this work about strong theologies of childhood. We have all theologies of childhood, assumptions about children, but strong theologies articulate multifaceted, multidimensional perspectives of children. They build on the Bible, the Christian tradition, other disciplines, and experience. And oops, um, I found I like to use this biblical paradoxes. It was like such a rich view of children. They're fully human, made in the image of God, but they're still developing and in need of instruction. They're gifts of God, sources of joy. Yet there's also social agents capable of selfish actions. They're vulnerable and in need of protection, yet also strong, insightful models of faith and endowed with gifts to serve others. So it was this much richer view than we had before. It's like, well, you better teach children, everything, you got to hand it down to them, It was just a revelation of how complex, and we see that in the social sciences, in medical research now, how really complex children are, and just honoring that complexity and these perspectives was really important and continues to be important, not only in my relation as my children grew up and even now as adult children, but also my students, and also how I think about my work in areas of child-focused research. So I kind of always have some funny little picture about that robust theologies of childhood. They're just not monofocal, just one dimension or adult-centered. They're very multifocal, child-inclusive lenses, and that enriches our relationship to them. So I just see in my country, I'll say a little more about that, but in my country, in the United States, we still have very narrow views of children that you see in the schools, you see in parental, you know, in the church sometimes, how, instructions for parents. Sometimes we are a country too, I'll say more about this later, where you are allowed in every state to hit your child. It's not against law, and as long as it's reasonable. And over 28% of children in our country are hit so hard by caregivers, they have injuries. So it's a strange view we have of children, and it's always good to check in our own work check our own assumptions, but to look around, whether it's the church or our society, that's really helped me see how narrow and adult-centered our views of children can be. So this work, that little book, got me going to get to know Keith and Haddon and John, the Child Theology movement, and a lot of international Christian initiatives. Just that simple book of looking at what have theologians said, if anything, about children. And so I learned so much from the work of the Child Theology movement. Keith, John, and Haddon, I was just so moved. I went to that Penang conference and 2020, I think it was 2002 or something. And I was so impressed because they had their, practitioners, theologians, just such a rich conversation. And that really opened my eyes to lots of ways we can talk about children in the church. Also, the Godly Play Foundation, it was neat to see. I'm very sad that Jerome Berryman just died also. He died, and I feel so sad about that. But he was someone I met through this work, and I really learned a lot from him. He had the best faith formation program when I was struggling with my child when he was 3. I was looking everywhere in the world for some great faith formation program and found his work. And then we met and we found each other's work, and I just enjoy him. I really miss him, and I feel his funeral, his memorial service will be next Monday in Denver. So meeting those people has been so great, and they fostered bigger connections too with like Shifaro and the Child Development Training Research Center in Addis, which what a visionary person Shifaro is and has been. And then the leaders in South Africa. I'm so glad Hanley's here at Northwest University. The work that they have done, what Hanley's done, and this Gert Reed, who recently died, also grieving him. So it opened up that's a real benefit of the Child Theology movement, kind of opening up even further connections with lots of people doing wonderful things like the holistic child development programs in Penang or the Philippines, Compassion International. So that was, I'm very grateful to Haddon and Keith and John for their work and the networks that they have opened. They've opened a lot of doors with broader networks. And they continue to do great work. I wanted to now talk a little bit about, this is where I'm going to talk about child attentive theologies and my new book, Child Theology. Because when I started doing these theologies of childhood, really what are our conceptions of children and obligations to them, I realized that we need to expand our vision and rethink not only our views of children, who are they? What are they? What are our obligations to them? But also many central doctrines and practices in the church. So it's really like other liberating theologies that, like feminist theology, Black theology, where you start out sort of saying, well, wow, we haven't paid attention to this group, but then you realize, wow, when we bring them into our community and into our worldview, they are helping us. We have to rethink our doctrines and practices. So, for example, with feminist theology, language of God, do we have to rethink that? Maybe it's too narrow once you have questions from feminist theologians. So I knew that there was now a need to do, and that's what Haddon and John and Keith really sparked really it prompted me to think about developing child attentive theologies that strengthen our commitments to children and our theology as a whole. We can talk about them as child attentive theologies or child theologies, where they build on diverse sources from the Bible, tradition, insights from other disciplines and experience, but they re-examine doctrines and practices with attention to the experience of the marginalized or exploited. And in this case, it's children. So it's kind of funny. I did these books on biblical views, theological views. I'll say a little more about interfaith views, but this was the last one because it was kind of the hardest to get systematic theologians. I tried to get systematic theologians from around the world, and I think they sent you the table of contents to it. And I was asking each of these theologians, now you've already written about, let's say, evil. You've already written about creation. But if you thought about children as you're thinking about this doctrine or practice, would it change what you think? Would it change what you think? So that was our common goal. And Rohan is here. He wrote about soteriology. And Michael Welker, a German theologian, wrote about creation. So we have wonderful Amos Young, who's written a lot about the Holy Spirit, said more than about the Holy Spirit and children and expanded his view and his reading of Acts, by saying, boy, I should pay a little more attention to children as I think about the Holy Spirit. Or I had an Orthodox theologian, a Greek Orthodox, who really, they think a lot about humility and the virtue of humility, but how would their community talk about it if you thought about children? Because sometimes we use being humble as almost like an oppressive kind of notion for children, right? Just be humble, shut up, be quiet. But is there a richer view of humility and that would be more child inclusive? So those are the kind of had a wonderful chapter by Kantz. Maybe some of you know DJ Kantz from Australia on reforming mission, thinking about mission. So and a wonderful theologian from South Africa, Dirk Smit, who has written about hope, but said more in relation to children. So it was kind of funny. We can talk more about this, but I think there's lots to think about. I feel like it's almost like throwing a tiny little stone into a big pool because there's so much to think about. I'm in touch with a lot of Roman Catholics, and they're thinking like, whoa, we have to rethink priesthood. What is the priesthood? And with attention to children. Or if we think about the church and the nature of the church, if children are part of the body, how might we shift our understanding of the doctrine of the church? Or as Amos Young did, the Holy Spirit. Discipline and discipleship is a really big issue in my country and among some theological circles and religious groups because it's interpreted so narrowly. Discipline as really, using corporal punishment on your children. So, but discipline and discipleship are much richer than that. So that's the kind of thing we can enrich theology as a whole, not just, hey, this will be nice for religious education. Yes, it will be. It will be nice for faith formation programs, but it's also really important for the church. And the introduction I wrote with my wonderful student colleague was strengthening theology by honoring children. So it's not just, oh, that's so cute. Oh my gosh, you're writing about children. That's so sweet. But hey, and I studied in Germany, ach, wir sind alle ernste Theologen. Das ist nicht für uns, I know what it can seem like. But it's so important. They're part of our humanity. So it serves the whole church, not just people working directly with children. So we can talk more about that. And Rohan could even say more about his chapter. And Keith and Haddon can say more about their work in this whole area of child theology, expanding our understanding of practices and doctrines. It's really important to do. And if you do it, it also helps promote attention to children across the curriculum in theological education. If you have systematic theologians being a little bit more interested in this, that will help people in biblical studies, church history, systematics, all pay more attention to children. Just like we have with Black theology, it's not just, the course on Black theology or the course on feminist theology. We have to think about marginalized groups in every class, right? But we still don't do it in theological education. In fact, in my country, A lot of times you don't have to take any course related to children at all, even though children are part of the ministry. They're in the church. And I think was it Anne? Yes, from Denmark. Even helping people understand why spiritual life is important is a problem right now. It's like there's all many other kinds of things we're up to. So, um, let's see. Um, oh, so I wanted to go, there we are. So those areas have really helped me in my work. I've also done a lot with interreligious understanding. I don't know if the imam is still here, but that's important too. We really learn a lot from interreligious understanding and cooperation. So I've done a couple books where we looked at primary texts in world religions, what they say about children, and then another one with Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And I really learned a lot from my Muslim and Jewish colleagues there. I made a lot of assumptions of, oh yeah, we all kind of think like that about adoption or about this or that. And it was like really great. And it really deepened my own understanding of my own tradition as well as their traditions. So that's really great work and probably happening in your hospitals and in all kinds of settings in countries, in all of our countries. I know in our country, we're the most religiously diverse country, they say now. And in our schools, in the hospitals, in business, we have to be religiously literate and engage people from different faiths or no faith. So I've learned a lot there. I've learned a lot from this growing area of childhood studies. Childhood studies is very interdisciplinary. It is a very, it's I've learned a lot from child-focused work in other disciplines, whether it's history, education, the social sciences, of course. And there is this amazing growing field of childhood studies. You can get a PhD at Rutgers University in Linköping. In Norway, they have a lot of programs where you can focus in a certain area, but in this whole field of childhood studies, just like women's studies grew once we realized, whoa, I guess women are people. Now childhood studies is growing. So it's an exciting field. They're finding things you think, well, we don't know what children thought, and they're finding all these diaries. They're finding um, just amazing things like childhood and history. This is Radar Asgard. He's at the University of Norway, and he got $1 million from the Norwegian Research Council. The Norwegians are pretty child supportive, I would say, to study history of childhood, history of conceptions, and they just found so many things like looking at graffiti, looking at graves, looking at diaries, looking at gravestones, just all kinds of things. And I learned a lot from that project. I co-edited this book on Nordic childhoods from folk beliefs to Pippi Longstocking with people from literature, history, law, and I learned so much from that project too. Now, faith formation and character development is so important, and this whole field is so important. And when Anne was talking about, you got to talk to people about why spirituality is important. That is a big issue in our country, I have to say. So I appreciate the work of theologians and social scientists on moral and spiritual development. I learned a lot from them. As I said, I learned a lot from Jerome Berryman, the whole Godly Play Foundation, but also the Search Institute that's in Minnesota. They talk about assets that help children thrive. And there's really a lot of work now in the social sciences. There's actually, I believe, in my context, social scientists, psychologists, sociologists now are very interested in spiritual life of children. It used to be like, I can't talk about that. That's not part of my field, right? You'd be embarrassed to say, as someone in psychology or sociology, yeah, I'm studying children. A spiritual life of children sounds so like wild, but they are very interested, partly because the science shows more and more, and those of you doing work directly in this area will know more, that when a child participates in a religious community and they have some assets normally. Of course, there can be abuse in churches, but really in any setting where there's young people, gymnasiums, right? Gymnastics programs, you name it. Um, Abuse of children is in all those contexts. But 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 the social scientists are coming and saying, we want to know more about what faith communities are doing. We want to work more with faith communities because even if you say, well, one big factor of child abuse is the mother's isolation, if a mother is involved in a church, they're not as isolated, and that's a protective factor for children. So they're almost my best friends, people in the social scientists who want to, prevent child abuse and neglect. And I've done some work in this area, like this, a couple people in Heidelberg and Emory University. They did a big project on character formation. What is forming character of young people today? And so I've done some of that, and I work in Lutheran higher education. We have students from all faiths or no faiths, but we talk about character and spiritual life. So that's a part. I've learned a lot from these initiatives. And finally, from child advocacy. Um, Child advocates, I admire them. That was another moving thing I learned from the work with Keith and Haddon and John. They were working with people, and a lot of you in this room with in many in many areas where you've got to be strong advocates for children. And so strengthening the church public advocacy for all children is really important. And if we enlarge our vision beyond children's immediate needs or the unborn, which we do in our country, it's kind of like, well, I'll just say, we don't always look at the needs of children. We don't always address poverty. We still have a high rate of child poverty in the United States, and systemic injustices, horrifying in education and healthcare. And sometimes the pro-life efforts in this country are so focused on abortion, they say nothing about a pro-child program. It's or pro-life across the lifespan. So they're not even talking about clean water and air for children. It's all so focused sometimes just in the womb, what's happening in the womb. When they come out, it's like, well, let's have something here for them, some clean air, water, education, healthcare. So I'm very excited about all the child advocacy efforts. I learn a lot from them. There's a lot of joint efforts across secular faith-based initiatives and with UNICEF or with World Council of Churches, Convention on the Rights of the Child. Lots of overlap with faith-based work with theologians and scientists and social workers. So I think it's really important to support faith-based organizations that work with children at risk too. And so some of my most recent work is addressing child abuse, neglect, and corporal punishment. In the past and the present, we have a indigenous peoples here up in Minnesota, also Canada, but and we've had these boarding schools, and I'm sure you've heard about some of the horrifying things that happened in boarding schools for indigenous peoples. And so we're really taking that into account right now and having to think about that, but also just the extent of child abuse. You can even hit in our country, there's 17 states where the schools can still hit your children. They can hit them in any way, they see fit. 17 states. And then in all states, again, you can, a lot of countries have banned corporal punishment in every setting because it's not really effective or good for you or good for children. So, but in our country, no, we haven't even signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we're the only country left in the world. It used to be Somalia and the United States, but not anymore. We're the only one. So we have a lot of work to do here. So I've been doing some work, again, with some people at Emory, but also some child abuse and neglect work, this journal, on the dangers of spanking, physical punishment, the limits of parental authority, the role not just of the family, but the church and the state in protecting children, the misuse of biblical texts and the notion of discipline, and the role of religious communities in child protection. So I've kind of moved toward that area right now. I'm even helping my church write something for our church but also working with this child abuse project. It's an international organization that's also in Minnesota here. So that is my conclusion, and I think we're pretty much within the time here. And maybe I might just say at the end, what's so striking for me is, and I saw this with Jerome Berryman, and I see it with Keith and Haddon, and how just remembering children are people and respecting that they're human beings that have dignity and worth is so powerful, but it doesn't always happen. Um, so just that, just remembering that is, it sounds like it shouldn't be odd or marginal, but it often is. Seeing them as real people and respecting them and their full humanity. So here's the question I have for you, and I'll get out of this. You can have questions for me, but I was kind of wondering what lessons and areas of inquiry have strengthened your work with and on behalf of children. And if you were going to do the next volume on child theology, what doctrines or practices in your faith community might need rethinking? I know, again, for Catholics right now, it's priesthood. What's the priesthood? For Protestants, it's discipline, discipleship. But what might be important for you? And then, I've just noticed how these robust theologies of childhood and child theologies that honor children's full humanity has strengthened so many areas of my life because it creates such a more respectful relation to children in whatever context you're in. It enriches your work. So I wondered how it strengthens the work you're doing. And just what is your current work? What directions do you want to pursue? So that's what I have. And I think I'll close it, but I think I'd just like to hear something about your lessons and what doctrines and practices, because we've talked a little bit about this child theology book, and then how the theologies of childhood really help you in your work and the child theology movement. And what's your current work? So I will stop sharing.
Marcia, thank you so much for taking us back in your journey and just helping us to see all that background that we may not know about your values and your influences. And we've seen so much of the fruit of your work, but just to see behind that, behind the curtain. And so really appreciate you sharing some of that. So I've got the chat open on my screen. So you may need just to raise your hand if you want to speak or ask a question. And I think Marcia has given us some wonderful questions. So I think you must feel free to go in any direction. And I think she's asked for comments as well as questions and a bit of feedback. So if you've got a question, fine. If you want to come back and clarify, if you want to comment on anything that Marcia's inquiry is obviously continuing today into our wider network. So let's continue to share with her. So over to everybody on the call. Again, Marcia, thank you so much for generously sharing with us. So I'm hoping that as you raise a hand, it will move around my screen. So okay. So the comment from Bridget, I was really interested in the link you made between child attentive theology and liberation theology. Are there any other thoughts or resources on this? I would be interested.
Oh,
Yeah, people are doing work in this area, and there's more work needed to be done. A guy named Stoller wrote a book, and this Craig Nissen at Wartburg Seminary, but other people, and like Bonnie Miller McLemore in a way does it that way. But there's so much work to be done, and I feel like this book was like a little tiny beginning, right? And it's kind of interesting, just like budgets, there's not as much attention to children in budgets, whether in the church or in our country, not as much for children. And in the same way, it's like the looking at doctrines and practice and some really shifting some things in our church. It's not always a priority, right? To do. We might have the child programs, we might do that, and we need to do that. And sometimes we don't even do that. But to also rethink, well, gosh, how do we think about the Holy Spirit or about the church or about the priesthood? So, and Keith and Haddon could say more too, I think, Mary. And
Yeah.
any others here.
Yeah. Does anybody want to come back on the liberation theology aspect of child attentive theology before Joseph asks his question?
Okay, Joseph.
Okay, all right. But I'm with you, Marcia. I think liberation theology from a child's, children's liberation theology as a contextual theology, I think really starting with the experience of the oppressed children that you're talking about, I think does bring another really important lens. So yeah, maybe that's the follow-up book, looking at it from a liberation contextual perspective out of after the systematic. So thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks. And I might pick everyone's brains, but start off with you, Marcia. I was just going to say, I think you mentioned R.L. Stoller, but this is the certainly a book that writes liberation theology from the context of children. The Kingdom of Children, a Liberation Theology.
Yeah, and do you want to say more too about your work, Joseph?
Yeah, I could. I because it very much is what I hope to be a future project, and because I have written, my journey was that I'm not going to have a long story about that, but I started to talk to children on a children's camp about issues and questions on faith and life and so on, and that really inspired me to start to converse with children rather than simply answer their questions, which made me discover what you were into with the whole subject, the hood of a child being a full person and so on. So what I did was I collected these questions, the conversations, gathered hundreds of questions from children in Sweden from different settings. And I wrote not a Q&A book, but a chapter book, which is like it's a systematic theology, but it's aimed with ages 10 to 15 in the language and based on their questions and way of thinking. And I've been in contact a little bit with British publishers. And I was in a conversation with Langham Publications only a few weeks ago, and being as they do, being focused on global on like publications on evangelical theology to the whole world basically, but the majority world in particular. The suggestion was that to collect questions from children from Global South, to write also to have like two other theologians who would write with me a similar type of book. But I think so in that way I would be really keen to get suggestions on people maybe somewhere in this digital room that feel like I would really want to be involved in this, and or if you have suggestions, that would be really helpful for me. But my question, sort of being so long-winded, but my question, Marcia, and to the room, what I really found so helpful is that to see children as theologians or as theological subjects themselves, which means that what really helped me was the actual conversation with the children, and not simply kind of getting the questions being like as if it would only be their questions that are useful for me as a theologian. So I just any ideas or any thoughts that comes to mind in terms of how to pursue a project like this, because I think and also what you what might be helpful for me as a Western theologian to when I start to relate and think about childhood and children in different cultural contexts from me. I mean, I lived in India for 2 years and so on, so I do have experience from different contexts, but how to go about it, what might be differences of views on children's and so on. So yeah, I suppose that's my question, and this is what I'm hope to do in the future in terms of child theology.
Great, Joseph. And while Marcia is responding to that, perhaps you might like to put your email in the chat.
Yeah,
and
I'll
then
do that.
people can take a photograph of that if we lose it in the recording anytime. So thank you. Marcia.
Yeah, I might just say, what's so interesting is there's so much we need to do related to children. Like when you say, it's really children's theologies, right? Or theologies for children is really important. Also, when I call, and sometimes we could talk about, I tried to explain it in the introduction to the book, how I'm using child attentive theology, but it's also another really important task, not just for talking to children, you can use some of that. But when this other task, which is also important, child attentive theologies, is for systematic theologians who are looking at all kinds of things, right? So there's just so many tasks. We have so much to do with child advocacy, children as theologians themselves, child attentive theology, theologies of childhood. And I think that whole framework of theologies of childhood that are really rich, that help us see, wow, children aren't just victims. They are victims, but they're also agents, right? And just kind of keeping that in mind. I know faith-based organizations that work with risk also say sometimes we don't acknowledge them as agents, participants as much as we should. So there's just that kind of always checking ourselves, always checking. And so I think just to honor your work, Joseph, but also to say the work everyone's doing, like the chaplaincy work, right? And the work with religious education, the work with spiritual formation, we still have so much work to do in all these areas, including, so that's why I kind of lifted up some of those areas, because and it's harder, and I think Keith and Haddon know this quite a bit, like you have to be ethically sensitive when you're working with children, right? To ask them their things. And like Robert Coles, who talked about with children about their spirituality. So I haven't worked as much in that, but it is important. So just there's a whole list, and like it kind of was neat when you were introducing yourself, because you have so many areas, you represent the work in the hospitals, the work in faith formation, spiritual formation, but theology, systematic theologies, honoring children as theologians. So I think others might have more to help, Joseph, but just to honor that as an area.
Marcia, did I hear you use the word assets in your presentation when you were talking about children?
Yes.
Because I think, I don't know whether you want to say any more about that to link those issues, because that I've been very influenced with that asset deficit model of seeing the spiritual assets in children rather than just seeing them in a traditional evangelical deficit, you're a sinner model. I don't know whether you might like just to link that to what Joseph was saying. Have you got any more thoughts on that?
Okay, or Haddon? Yeah, I think, and then I was talking to you about Search Institute assets, looking at, sometimes you'll say, well, they're in a divorced family, it's all, it's going to be terrible. But then you see, whoa, if they had a grandparent, if they had a church community, if they had, were in music, had other mentors, then they can thrive. It's that asset, attending to assets. Yeah, so I think that's similar. What are the assets agency of children, as well as where where they're highly vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
So, Haddon, were you going to say something? Or Paul, you better be the one looking at everyone. But
Yeah, well, we got Caroline and then Rowan next.
Okay, go ahead.
Just to build on what you've been saying, Marcia, about children as assets, but also the different theologies, in response to Joseph's point, listening to the children, but also paying attention to the theologies that they're absorbing. So what is the operant theology of their church? What is their parent theology? And as you ask them questions, as you listen to them, you will see some of that reflected back, and sometimes there will be their own understandings and experiences that they're sharing, but also sometimes they are literally reflecting back what they've heard from their parent, or what they have absorbed from their church that says, we love children, they're fantastic, but they always go out and they always, leave the service to go to their classes, and those theological perspectives about children they're absorbing. My work on children and holiness, I used pictures a lot to listen to children, because that gave them a starting point and enabled them to be in control of that process. Because we did some research with under fives and just showed them the pictures and allowed them to then lead that process by pointing to the things that interested them and the things that resonated with them. So I think there are lots of creative ways that are used in social science that actually enable us to listen very particularly to children.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great, Caroline. It's really, really helpful that I think what Marcia's modeled for us is us not being afraid to triangulate our faith with other disciplines, as well as the voice of the children. And I think we're always richer not to be threatened by that, but to be able to facilitate us going deeper. So yeah, thank you. Rowan.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Marcia, thanks for recalling the journey of child theology movement, and especially what I really recalled was when I was doing my master's, I was dealing my areas of research which continues to be, is rights and theology, focusing on child rights and Christian theology, more specifically liberation theology. So it was during that time my teacher literally held my hand, took me to the library and said, your research will be incomplete if you do not read this book. And that was The Child in Christian Thought.
Oh, that's great.
So that's where I got connected to Child Theology movement. And I think that's when I wrote to you first.
Yeah.
So
You've done such great work on children's rights and labor and all kinds of topics.
And since then, later for my PhD as well on the agency of the child and liberation theologies. My book will come out in a couple of months' time, which is Advancing the Agency of the Child. And I argue that to advance the agency of the child, three principles should work together, and I call it the purposeful triad. As much as we speak of the agency of children, there should be something called rooted solidarity of the adults. And the idea of rooted solidarity of the adults is there in my chapter in the new book that we discussed on soteriology. Because in the chapter on soteriology, I was talking about salvation includes humanization. That's an Indian interpretation of salvation of an Indian theologian by name M.M. Thomas. Then salvation as liberation. And in the same chapter, I had also mentioned salvation, meaning how there should be a sense of transformation among the adults to work alongside children. And as you rightly say, to be attentive, not just work along, to be attentive, to transform, and then rework the methods of working along with children. That is what I call rooted solidarity. It's there in the article. And the fourth principle, which I had just touched and gone in the article was about the whole idea of children as mystery. I draw this idea from Martin Marty's The Mystery of the Child, and where he explains beautifully, as much as we want to explore the mystery of God, there is so much of mystery in children that we need to explore. Only then we are doing theologies that are involving children, that learns from children. And as the child theology vision says, that's when we'll be able to question the traditional theologies and doctrines. The first thing that attracted me to child theology movement was the definition that Marcia gave. It questions traditional theologies and doctrines. Until then, I knew that we could question theologies, but then I started realizing, okay, we could question doctrines as well, because we know how doctrines are crystallized. Theologies are crystallized into doctrines. So doctrines are basically theologies and their foundation. So you can always question doctrines. That was an eye-opener. So in that sense, in my book, I say that three things should work together to advance the agency of the child. What I call the deeper understanding of the agency of the child, the rooted solidarity of the adults, and the immanent mystery of God and the child. It's not just about God, but also about the child. So I draw this lot from Martin Marty. So this is what I've been doing so far, and also to make it more interdisciplinarily, draw a lot of ideas of how solidarity works in our own context. And that's from where you draw deeper ideas of agency. Just a few days ago, I did a presentation in the University of Manchester, because now I'm in UK, and that's where I did my PhD. What does solidarity look like when we work along with children? So that was the presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And in terms of doctrines, if there's one doctrine that I wish to work on, it will be Christology. Otherwise, because we have projected Jesus only as an adult Christ, we do not wish to go back to the childhood of Jesus. I mean, because there are a lot of confessional questions, whether we should, in terms of what the child Jesus would have done, is that really a question that we should ask? If we ask that question, will that question our traditional doctrine of an adult God that we want to safeguard all the time? So these are the kind of questions I want to work on.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Marcia, do you want to come back on any of that? So rich.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, give us the name of the book, and then in the chat, would you, Rohan? And then who was next, Paul? Excellent. Oops, you muted yourself, Paul.
That's intentional, so James can speak.
Oh.
All right, thank you. Very good, Marcia. Ton of great questions. A little bit overwhelmed. I think we first met probably the only time we met was in Houston with Jerry Berryman, and I'm very sad to hear about his passing away. We have my wife and I, we fell in love with Godly Play, even though she wasn't there. I came home from Houston all excited and tried to get our church interested. And what we've ended up doing, we went to training a few years ago, and we mix Godly Play. This last weekend, we were in a group of missionaries training in a favela situation, and we started off with Godly Play. It's a marvelous thing for adults and children. We bring local public schools to our artist workshop area, and we are able to use Godly Play with these children, and we did Martin Luther King, and it brought up so much stuff, and the teachers were like, wow, this is really good. Yeah, it's a real loss, but he contributed a lot. I can't talk much on the academic side, but what we have done is, I think what Child Theology has, it was always child in the midst, and it's interesting you put almost a more straightforward, I don't know how to say it, this child attentive. I love the name Child Attentive. It's very clear. And I'm already picking it up. And I think that's one of the first things that Child Theology brought to us about 20 some years ago, was this whole thing of being attentive to children in the scriptures. But it also, in our own work, or with those who we take care of, a lot of people who are working with children. And I think that is some of the largest contributions. Another thing is we've also been able to benefit from having more of a critical language to resources that we want to bring into 4 organizations around Brazil. It gave us, I think, more criteria. We've brought in a product from Claves from Uruguay, very well done, which is a child preventive for abuse. It's a wonderful program. It's gone through various countries in South America and Central America, and that is going very good. Just the whole thing of, does this product not only give something to the child, but does it allow the child to speak? Does it allow the child to contribute? Is it something that will help the person who is teaching listen, receive from the child? And I think in our own work, and in my own work, like doing photography or stuff like that with children, it opened my eyes to say, hey, wait, I'm here for the child, but I'm sweating, I might be in water, whatever, and the joy that I learned to say, wait, the child's giving me, offering me something. And I could this is so much better. And we try and take that same idea for the workers who are working with children, because they're exhausted, they're dealing with death, they're dealing with, their own family lives and all this other problem. And so that's another contribution that I think we work, since the pandemic, we have been working on with Christian educators, the whole thing of resilience and hope and all of these things. And so this is one of the things that we have been able to try and say, look, yes, you're there to help the child, but the child, what does they offer for you? What are the spiritual resources of joy and so forth? That's pretty much it. It just was really good to hear all the things that are going on, and your many questions, almost too many questions, but that's good. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, James. And I think if you might be willing to share a future gathering like this, I think it'd be really interesting to pick up some of the threads that you've mentioned. And that's an offer that goes out to other people as well. So Marcia, I'm mindful of time, and we've got a quarter of an hour.
Okay.
I can't see any other hands, and so if you'd like to just come back on any of those issues, or ask again of any of your questions, I think that would just be really, we'd just like to give that bit of time to you before we just get any other feedback from around the network. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just this sense of honoring everybody's work in the room, because so much needs to be done, in all these areas. And I think just that how easy it is for people to dismiss children. It's really, really easy. Even we have to stay alert too. And just what you were saying, James, about listening. Like my students, a lot of them are no longer in the church, even though they grew up in the church. And the reasons they're not are just incredible. Like people didn't listen to me. I couldn't ask any questions. They have like what? What? You couldn't ask any questions? We have Lutherans and Catholics think you can't be a scientist and a Christian. Can you believe that? So, I mean, those two traditions are like, wow, we celebrate advances in the sciences that help the common good, right? And so there's just so much dismissing of children. It's easy to make assumptions. Even when I was working with the systematic theologians at first, I'd say it was really hard for a couple of them to wrap their mind around. It was more like, I've said this about creation, and they should include it in the Sunday school material. And that was like the task, to put my theology into the Sunday school material. But it was like, well, no, we're talking about, you wrote about the doctrine of creation. If you said a little more, thought a little more about children as people and part of humanity, would it shift, maybe tweak, maybe change, but shift what do you say about creation? Even about things like image of God or our environmental protections, if you think about children, like in our country too, right now, the environmental issues, sometimes they don't recognize it's harder for kids. The air pollution, the water pollution is like much more damaging to a child. And then this abuse and neglect in the home is just toxic, right? It has long-term health effects if you know about those adverse childhood experiences. So I just want to honor all the work you're doing, and then to just there are these pockets of areas we need to do stuff. The child advocacy, working with systematic theologians, but working with children in their own ideas, and working with in hospitals. So there's just a lot to be done. And how important it is to keep in mind this richer view of who children are, kind of checking our own assumptions is so important. I see the fallout with all these poor young people, 18 to 20-year-olds, who are just like, science? You can't be a scientist and a Christian? Like, whoa, the religious right in our country, which has very narrow views about children and science, I'm just saying it from my country, has really affected everybody's perspectives on Christianity. It's been very difficult. So I just honor all the work in the room, and that it's all important, and that we can make distinctions too. Sometimes with children, it's like, oh, that's a little pocket over there with children. But no, it affects all we're doing when we're talking about all kinds of issues, right? Whether it's environmental stuff, whether it's doctrines and practices, it should all be in there, right? But it's often just shoved over there, right? So I just honor everybody in the room, and honor the child theology movement for really sparking so much attention to the complexity of children, the beauty of children, the all the kinds of questions you opened up, Keith and Haddon and John, for us in the room.
Marcia, thank you. Thank you for honoring the network and those individuals, but we want to come and honor you and your contribution to this, and sharing your journey and taking us on some of that journey, and your graciousness and generosity of including us and encouraging us as a network is just indicative of the spirit that you've brought to Child Theology movement and the work that you've done. And so really,
was it okay that I lifted up those areas for people? It wasn't too much. It was mainly not so much my journey, but look at all we can learn from any pocket we enter, right? And that we can all keep working and enhancing and supporting each other's work. So I hope that was clear.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
There's been some stimulating comments there of some, a little bit of pain and angst of how journeying with you, that how it's not been, children are still being marginalized today in church, was a comment And
Yeah.
somebody's just
Yeah.
mentioned about spiritual abuse,
Yeah.
as well as those other things. So maybe, that we appreciate you liberating us to continue to realize how much we've done, but how much we can still contribute and collaborate together to develop. So thank you very much. So out of all of this, Keith is waving. We'll help Keith not have to raise his hand on a Zoom. So Keith.
Yeah, in at one stage in the preparation for this, I was going to introduce Marcia, but the wonderful thing is it's happened. The good news, in case you didn't know, is John Collier was hoping to join us. He's been mentioned several times, and he's asked that there be a recording. So I'm not quite sure why he's not with us. But Marcia, you'll be pleased to know I've done my very best to get John connected from Portugal. Please, I had no idea Rowan was just 1 hour from Mill Grove. And in the next week, Rowan, can you get a bus down the M11 to come and see us, please? Because one of the beautiful things about the Child Theology movement was there's a place called Mill Grove. And I found myself in two worlds, lecturing at a theological seminary while living among children. And I discovered that the challenge was not in the seminary, but among the children. That's where the real questions were going on. But what I'd like to do is just to say a thank you, Marcia. I think there's too much that's going on. So my heart and head are completely overwhelmed. So it's been such a joy to what's happened today has been a lovely part of the journey and conversation. That's something, it's so special, conversation. And I just wonder, I sometimes think of American politics and wonder whether conversation is a dying art, but that's another matter. Nothing more to say. Special that Haddon's here and he's been listening so much. I've watched him so much. I'm trying to imagine his comments. So I've got a list of things I thought he was asking, and later I'll ask him whether I was right. Just a couple of things about the journey, if I may. It's a way of saying thank you, but also what a joy to know that the conversation is expanding, it's developing in different parts of the world, and something that's been sparked has really sparked into life. Just to say that the book, The Child in Christian Thought, lovely to hear how Rowan was led by hand to it, like a little child, possibly. So it was put in my hands at a meeting of Viva, actually. And I was at a meeting, but I have no idea what happened at the meeting because under the table, I was reading this book. So it was quite subversive. And I asked John whether he'd go in search of Marcia. So John Collier crossed the Atlantic and found Marcia and found her wonderfully responsive. And the rest in some ways is history. In The Child in the Bible, I was privileged to be part of a discussion over 2 days among the authors. And Marcia, you were there as well, so you know this. People like William Brown, and so it went on, just saying, look, I'd missed this in my specialist bit of the Bible. I hadn't realized that wisdom was actually playing while creation was going on. Not just happy, but playing. And why had the translators decided that wisdom couldn't be playing? Was that too childlike? And then, of course, along comes Jerome Berryman and more. I'm just very struck by the fact that having Haddon here and you, Marcia, reminds me that in this very place at Mill Grove, I used to try and facilitate trustees' discussion. And you, Marcia, often used to sit on my left and Haddon on my right. And it was just wonderful to realize what a rich conversation was going on. And may this be something that continues to happen. I realize the CTM booklets haven't been referred to, but the idea was that questions that came up should be responded to in booklet form. And I think today, I reckon there are something like 25 questions that would merit a booklet. And so we might think about that. And just to say that we've been wondering how to celebrate the 21st birthday of the Child Theology movement. COVID got in the way, but today has been something of a celebration. If I'd thought about it, I would have had candles and perhaps some champagne. Millgrove isn't the best place to have champagne, by the way. But I think this is a lovely, you know, and when I won't talk about whiskey, Marcia, at all. But the beautiful thing is that it's lovely to thank you, Marcia, and think of your two children. Give them love, please. And what happens in this conversation? Clearly, it's way out of anyone's, what can I say, jurisdiction or control. Not that child theology was ever under anyone's control, but you can see it's now bursting to life. As in my own subject of sociology, where the sociology of childhood has expanded exponentially around the world, it is just burgeoning. The conferences and so on, just to give an example. But I'd like to say this. I think that you've been on a journey, Marcia. I've been on a journey. Haddon's been on a journey. John and others of us. That's John Collier. And today's conversation is an opportunity to just, I think people see in your story, Marcia, that this journey has been blessed and a blessing beyond comprehension. And it's a journey as followers of Jesus. The one word I want to put into our conversation is Jesus. We got near there where Roa mentioned Christology, and yet coming to the feet of Jesus, if we're being child attentive, will mean as we seek to interpret God's word as part of the household of faith, is something where Jesus is always going to be smiling when we're child attentive, not least because he's calling us. This is a word we haven't used very much. We've talked about sin and children. That's something that's when we talk about assets or deficits. But Jesus is calling us to repentance. He's calling me to repentance today. Keith, today, if you will hear my voice, will you repent, become humble like the little children, and welcome them? I'm so thrilled at Millgrove. We welcomed 2 new children yesterday into our family, and one is thriving. If I were to put one other thing into the conversation, it's the Bible, and seeking to see whether we can do justice to representing Bibles for people worldwide, including families and children, and the repentance that we need to experience, to involve ourselves in again, means it's something beyond church. It's the kingdom of heaven, beyond, within, among, whatever it is. And I leave with the testimony, the whole time the child theology movement has been growing, I've been working on one woman from the south, Pandita Ramabai. And when we talk about how can we hear voices from the south, then is it not possible to listen to someone who spent her life committed to children and women in India, translated the whole Bible from Hebrew and Greek for her own people, set up a community? And what I've discovered is that actually now I've been living with Ramabai for so long, living as in the sense of studying her, virtually no one in the West remotely listens or cares. Not she's an Indian woman and she's marginalized. And I've found that alongside her, I've discovered what it is to be marginalized, and yet to find myself at the foot of Jesus with her. He's saying, welcome, welcome. I know how it is.
Great.
So that's a way of saying.
I'm just very mindful of time.
Thank you, Paul. That's it. That was it.
All right. Okay. Great. I think it's really important to make that generational connection around that, and you guys being thanked. We did just say we'd just do some other news around the network, and I just wanted to make sure. I appreciate time is up. Elizabeth has got her hand up. Elspeth, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Marcia, for taking us the journey of yours. And sorry for coming in late with my comment. I just wanted to quickly share my work that I am doing. Of course, my master's research was on child theology and children at risk. And that's how I first met Dr. Keith when he visited India. And that really prompted me to do my doctoral research as well in the area of children. I did face some difficulty with my pursuing, child theology again. So I had to make some slight changes in my research area. But I told my university people that I will not leave children's issues. I want to stick on it because that's what my vision and my passion lies in. So currently my doctoral research that I'm working on is on children and sexuality. Of course, again, I guess it's a bit sensitive for the topic children and sexuality. So I'm particularly focusing on children with intersex conditions and how parents and doctors take away the voice of the child to have an opinion on their own sexuality by doing surgeries on their bodies in order to fit into the binary of male and female. And so I'm on my journey now to explore more on the rights of children's sexuality and their rights, their voices, and their agency. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Right. Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to share any other updates? Elsbeth, if you could if you wanted to reach out to that intersex work was something we first studied as a pediatric chaplaincy network in the UK, and so if you struggle with some UK research, reach out to us and we'll put you in touch with some really helpful work that's been going for a while now. So it's really, really important area. Nobody else. Okay. Well, look, folks, please do reach out. I think if Marcia's done nothing for us today is to just give us, I've counted at least another 25 topics that we could cover. And given we're only meeting about 3 or 4 times a year, I think we got the rest of the syllabus for the rest of for this decade. And I think reach out to Marcia again with these theology ideas. Because again, I think what we've raised around as that Jesus as a child has got raised in our context just the other day, of Jesus being fully human and fully God as a child, and what that meant in his child development. I thought was a really fascinating way in which to frame it as a group I was with the other day, Marcia, and so I think, there, as you say, there's so much more there that we would love to just all build on what you've been doing. And so thank you again so much. And championing play as well as perhaps what some of us might believe as a universal way in which to relate and engage with children. So thank you for so many endorsements around that sphere. So there's lots of thank yous going up, and there is a recording. Corinne will be holding that recording when we finish and get that up on the website. We're talking about for our January meeting, John has kindly offered to share his research around George MacDonald for January. And so perhaps, James, if we could get if you'd be so kind as to contact us again and get a date in the diary for after that. And then Joseph, maybe that might come round again for you to share about some of the things you've been saying. But folks, please don't be modest. Reach out to us as a network, as the current trustees, because we really would love to hear your ideas and come and share, as we've heard today, to continue for us to have that corporate wisdom as a network for those motivated and interested and stimulated and influenced in child theology. So Marcia, thank you again. Rowan, thank you. Yeah, that would be great for you to do that. You can trial it out on Keith when you meet him next week, Rowan. Go and do that. That will be great. I'd love to be a fly on the wall for your conversation. So Marcia, thank you again. We had
Thank you to all of you for your journeys and all the work you do. So thank you.
That's great. Okay, thanks everybody. I really do appreciate all the contributions, and we look forward to connecting, and we will share a date for the new year. And again, please don't be shy. We'd love to hear your contributions and your ideas. James, was that a buy or a question or a comment? It was a wave, I think. Great. Well, look, I think as people drop off, you and Keith can say some other farewells and everything, Marcia. So unless you've got to rush off, because I'm sure Haddon's not said very. Oh, I think he might have just popped off, but
yeah,
there he is. He's still there. So you guys, I think, feel free